Welcome to today's webinar from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Today, our Discovery Series webinar is going to take a deep dive into the topic of hybridization in birds. We're hosting this webinar from Ithaca, New York, and as such, I'd like to read a statement acknowledging the indigenous people as the original inhabitants of this area. So Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, which is the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and a contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokono dispossession, and we honor the ongoing connection of the Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So Jess, if you don't mind turning off the screen there. All right. So my name is Laura Kammermeyer, and I'm your host for today. And joining me is Jessica Kane, who's going to help us out with some of the technology. Hi, Jess. Thanks for helping out. So we want to give you a few logistical things to go over. First of all, we will be recording this and we'll send it out sometime within the next, it could be tomorrow, it could be next week. It depends on how long it takes to edit out some of the beginning and the ends of it. So as soon as we can, we get that out to everyone who registered for the webinar. And we also put it on the blog or the news section of the Birds of the World webpage. So that will be coming. If you would like to have closed captioning, it is available in English. So all you do with that is click the captions button at the bottom of your screen. And Jess, was there a few other things we wanted to cover?
Yes, did you mention chat? Sorry.
I did not.
You did not, okay. If you have any questions, please put those in the Q&A section. There's a button for the Q&A. Please type your questions in there. Feel free to keep chatting in the chat box. If you want everybody to see your message, you do have to change the to everyone instead of just hosts and panelists, which is the default. Other than that, I think we are good to go.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. All right, thank you so much. Great. So let me just share my screen for a second here. Great. All right. So as you know, Birds of the World continues to evolve, and we want it to be not only more useful to birders, but to capture more and more scientific information so that we could tell a fuller story of the biology and the evolution of every species of bird. In December, we added a new feature to our species accounts called hybridization. Let me show you what that looks like. This new section is found under the systematic section of the web pages. So we've got the navigation on the left, and you can scroll down here to do hybridization. And what this does is it dynamically integrates the multimedia of known hybrids into our species profiles so that the appearance, location, and ecology of these hybrid crosses are available for your study and comparison. So in addition to the multimedia that we have, which I'll show you how that looks. Okay, so these are all coming from our Macaulay library and from eBird submissions from people like you, so thank you. And Shawn's going to go into this in a bit more detail a little bit later. I just want to give you a vision of what that looks like. There's also a lot of narrative content. We are also producing, as we can, the narrative content to accompany that section as well. So in order to talk about this and help us understand why this is special, why we're, why did we add this and what value does it provide to us as scientists, to you as a birder, we wanted to bring on 2 evolutionary ecologists to discuss not only what hybridization is and what we can learn from it, but how you have the power to help us advance the scientific understanding of this topic and how and where it occurs in nature. So if our panelists can now turn on their videos, that would be great. All right, welcome. So first, let me introduce Shawn Billerman. Shawn is science editor with the Lab of Ornithology, and he's been working on taxonomy, family accounts, and editing species accounts for Birds of the World since 2019. Shawn is a true expert on speciation and bird families, and he is the co-author of Bird Families of the World, which was updated and adapted for the Birds of the World website. Hello, Shawn.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone.
And second, while I was originally supposed to introduce our colleague Jen Wash, who's a research associate in the Fuller Evolutionary Lab, she unfortunately got a bout of laryngitis. So I hope she does well. But fear not, we've been given a last-minute save by a wonderful scientist named Kathryn Grabenstein. Hello, Kathryn.
Hi there.
So Kathryn was recently named a Rose Postdoc Fellow at the lab, and she comes to us from the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where she worked with Dr. Scott Taylor studying hybridization in chickadees. So it's a perfect match, and we're grateful to you, Kathryn, for being able and eager to join us at such a last minute. So if you guys wouldn't mind just doing us a favor of giving a quick introduction to yourselves, let the audience know, what you do at the lab and what you're interested in.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Shawn Billerman, and as Laura said, I'm a science editor with Birds of the World, and have been with Birds of the World since 2019. As part of my work with this project, I also help with the Clements checklist. And prior to this position, I was a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where working in the Fuller Evolutionary Biology program, where I studied hybridization across the Great Plains of North America, specifically focusing on the hybrid zone between eastern and spotted towhee, bullocks and Baltimore oriole, and black-headed and rose-breasted grosbeak. I have been particularly fascinated with hybridization and speciation in general for quite some time, and I also studied hybridization as part of my PhD research, where I studied the hybrid zone between red-naped and red-breasted sapsucker.
Great. So my name is Kathryn Grabenstein. I'm a new Rose postdoctoral fellow at the Lab of Ornithology. So as Laura mentioned, I did my PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder with Dr. Scott Taylor. Broadly, I study hybridization in human contexts, specifically how when humans kind of transform ecosystems by building cities, they can create conditions that cause these co-occurring species to hybridize. For my dissertation work, I founded and directed the Boulder Chickadee Study as an experimental framework and citizen science network to explore the natural histories of Colorado chickadees and also to improve our understanding of how humans are shaping evolutionary trajectories. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about all things hybridization. It's such a rich field of study that's really been revitalized by both citizen science observation platforms such as eBird and also the genomic revolution.
All right, thank you both for being here today. I'm really excited to get into this. So we accepted all the audience's questions in advance for this show. We might be able to handle a few at the end, so we'll do our best. It was nice that a lot of your questions did kind of fall tightly into pretty defined categories. So we thought it would be great and helpful if we could get all on the same page. And Kathryn has offered to do a brief primer on hybridization. So with that, Kathryn, if you wouldn't mind taking it away and sharing your screen with us.
Absolutely. And does that look good? You should be able to see just single slide. Perfect. Awesome. So as Laura mentioned, before we jump into questions, we thought it would be really helpful to give kind of a broad overview of hybridization by first kind of defining key concepts and some commonly used terms. So as a brief kind of roadmap of what I'll go over, I'll talk briefly about what exactly is hybridization. I'll discuss reproductive isolation, which we consider to be the hallmark of speciation. I'll talk about how hybrids are classified, so what is a hybrid? And I'll briefly touch on hybrid zones, which are just one example of where hybridization occurs. And I'll lastly talk about what becomes of hybrids and hybridizing populations. So is hybridization good or bad? So scientists and naturalists alike have long marveled at nature's many forms, wondering what are the forces that are responsible for both generating and maintaining the incredible biodiversity that we see across planet Earth. And central to this is the process of speciation, whereby a single population splits into two separate species. Of course, there are many ways to define a species, which Shawn is going to address a little bit later in this webinar, but here I'm going to use the biological species concept, which defines a species as a group of organisms that interbreeds and produces fertile offspring. And a critical caveat here is that not only do these individuals interbreed, but they don't interbreed with other species. So here in this schematic, these bluebirds are going to breed with bluebirds and only bluebirds. And we call this reproductive isolation. So these blue birds are reproductively isolated from these yellow birds. Now, of course, it takes a really long time for speciation to basically go to completion. So thousands, on the order of thousands to millions of years. And so that takes just that amount of time for the reproductive evolution. Oh my goodness. The evolution of reproductive isolation. So when species are basically still in this process of diverging, interbreeding does occur. And we call this interbreeding hybridization. So for a formal definition, hybridization is the interbreeding of individuals from two or more populations that are distinguishable on the basis of one or more heritable character. And historically, these characters were considered to be pieces of an individual's phenotype, right? So how an individual looked. But now in the genomic era, we're using markers in individuals' genomes as these characters to distinguish hybrids from parentals. And so the classic example I typically give of a hybrid is that of a mule, right? A cross between a horse and a donkey. And this seems like a relatively simplistic barnyard example, but we know that natural hybridization in the wild is incredibly common in a wide variety of plant and animal taxa. And it's incredibly common in birds. So as many as 895 species of birds are known to hybridize in nature. That's about 10%. And of those 10% that do hybridize, about 28% of those are hybridizing across genera. We know that hybridization does vary geographically. It appears to be more common in temperate areas versus the tropics, and more common in terrestrial birds than seabirds. Ducks and geese, probably a surprise to no one, readily hybridize. So about 1 out of every 2 species is capable of hybridizing in nature. But we also see high instances of hybridization in grouse, partridges, woodpeckers, gulls, hummingbirds, herons, and hawks. And so why birds so readily hybridize compared to other animals like mammals, for example, is a really robust area of evolutionary biology, but seems to be due to the fact that bird genomes are highly conserved. And what that means is that there's not really a lot of opportunity for these kind of fatal mismatches as genomes are reshuffled in hybrid offspring. So if we go back to talking about reproductive isolation, I told you that it's this defining characteristic of speciation. And so we really consider it to be the hallmark of speciation, such that when reproductive isolation is complete, we call these good species. But what exactly is reproductive isolation? It can be a bit of a nebulous term to kind of wrap your head around. But I think of it as anything that prevents a species from interbreeding and or producing viable offspring with another species. And this isolation is comprised of these reproductive barriers. And these barriers are any biological phenomenon that either prevents hybridization from occurring in the first place. So we call these prezygotic, right? This is some sort of isolation that occurs before a zygote is formed, or some sort of barrier that prevents hybrids that are produced from surviving and reproducing. And we call these post-zygotic barriers. And you can really think of these barriers as components of birds' natural history, right? It's where they live, what they eat, how they attract mates, how they raise their young, and so on. And so I'll step through just a couple quick examples of each of these forms of reproductive barriers. So the first, which is probably the most obvious, is geographic isolation. So we're back to our schematic of bluebirds and yellowbirds. In this scenario, we have bluebirds that breed down at low elevation in the city and yellowbirds that breed in high elevation up in the mountains. And so because they're physically separated in space, they don't have the opportunity to interbreed, and we call this geographic isolation. Alternatively, our bluebirds and yellowbirds might breed in the same place, but at different times of the year. And this would be temporal isolation, right? So they're separated not in space, but in time. Let's presume then that hybridization does occur. So we have hybrids being produced, here shown by these green birds, but we see selection against these hybrids such that they don't fare as well as either the bluebirds or the yellowbirds. So in this example, our yellowbirds might sing a yellow song that attracts yellow females. Our bluebirds sing a blue song, which attracts blue females. And preferences for these songs is really, really strong, such that when our green bird sings his green song, he fails to attract a mate. So he might actually be capable of producing viable offspring, but in this scenario, he doesn't attract a mate and therefore fails to reproduce. So this would be an example, again, of post-zygotic isolation, where our hybrids have been formed, but are failing to survive or reproduce. We might also see something known as hybrid sterility, where again, here in this scenario, our green bird sings a blue song that attracts a blue female, but because of various genetic incompatibilities between their genomes, they fail to produce viable offspring. And so a lot of what we know about hybridization in terms of these reproductive barriers comes from really well-studied hybrid zones. And so hybrid zones are these kind of geographic areas where hybridization consistently occurs on the landscape. So here I'm showing a schematic of red and yellow shafted flickers with the orange shafted flicker in the middle. And again, this area of kind of overlap and hybridization is really, really pretty narrow and geographically consistent in the Great Plains. And so again, hybridization can occur in a hybrid zone, but not all hybridization does happen in hybrid zones. So briefly, a hybrid zone, I'll pull this definition from Harrison 1990, comes basically is defined as interactions between genetically distinct groups that result in some offspring of mixed ancestry, with the key caveat being that you have pure parental populations of genetically distinct groups on either side of this zone of interaction. So again, another example of a well-studied avian hybrid zone. Here we have Baltimore and Bullock's orioles, which also hybridize over the Great Plains. And the key thing here is that not all hybrids are the same. So you can see at the bottom of the schematic, there's a lot of variation in how these hybrid individuals are looking, which suggests that there's variation in these kind of genomic compositions of these different hybrids. And so this begs the question, how exactly are we classifying hybrids? Historically, before we had the genomic tools that we have today, we relied almost exclusively on phenotype, right? So we have, this is a pretty clean example where you have a red shafted flicker and a yellow shafted flicker. They vary by a lot of different traits, the most obvious being the color of the undershaft of their wings. And these hybrids, thankfully, if you remember your color wheel, red and yellow give us orange, which would be intermediate to either parental type. But now that we have genomic tools, we're actually capable of reading genomic markers, in some cases, a handful of markers scattered throughout the genome, or as our technologies have advanced, we're actually capable of reading the entire genomic sequences of these individuals. And so this is really where hybridization research is going, is we're using both phenotype and genotype to classify these hybrid individuals. So as I mentioned, not all hybridization occurs in hybrid zones. So this fellow named Anderson in 1948 was studying spiderworts at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and he noticed that basically these hybrid spiderworts were popping up in areas that had been disturbed by people. So one species of spiderwort really liked these sunny slopes. The other species preferred these kind of wet, like valleys that are a little shadier. And in places where people had stirred up the habitat or stirred up the dirt to create this intermediate habitat, he noted these intermediate spiderworts. And this led him to suggest that humans could modify the habitat such that hybridization was more likely to occur, and also the hybrids that were produced were more likely to survive. And so I'm going to call this disturbance-mediated hybridization. And this is really distinct from the hybridization we see occurring in hybrid zones, because these two species typically overlap and co-occur, but don't hybridize until some sort of disturbance occurs that changes the way these species interact and now promotes hybridization. And so some of my early work from my dissertation documented this phenomenon of hybridization following habitat disturbances in a wide variety of taxa, both widespread geographically and across the tree of life. So this begs the question, what becomes of these hybridizing populations, and is it necessarily good or bad for species? And the simple answer is it depends. So we know that hybridization happens when reproductive isolation breaks down, and there's a lot of different outcomes. So first, the classic example that I gave you of the mule, we could have a genetic dead end, right? So that mule is sterile. It can't produce any offspring. So we consider that to basically be a genetic dead end where that individual is not going to breed, they're not going to reproduce. We might also see the formation of a stable hybrid zone, which of course is shaped in many different ways. And there's lots of different dynamics that happen in stable hybrid zones. We can also see genetic swamping in the form of a hybrid swarm. This is really common in fish. So if anyone is an avid fisher human, you might have basically caught lots of fish that look basically half like a brook trout or half like a rainbow trout. It's particularly common in places where trout have been introduced to increase fish stocks. We might also see what's known as adaptive integration. So integration is when we have alleles from one population moving into the another population through this repeated backcrossing of hybrids with one parental. And in the cases where those alleles provide some sort of adaptive benefit, so they allow those individuals to survive or reproduce better, we would call that adaptive integration. This is really hard to demonstrate in wild systems because it requires a lot of experiments. So it's best been demonstrated in pretty strong cases of mosquitoes and pesticide resistance, but it is a possible outcome of hybridization. And then lastly, we might see hybrid speciation, whereby hybrids are produced and are completely reproductively isolated from either parental species and really only interbreed with each other. So again, all of these outcomes are really variable. It depends on the context. It depends on the players. It depends on a lot of different environmental factors. And so this is a really, really active area of current research that we're going to talk a little bit more about today, because the short answer is it depends on what happens with hybridizing populations. So to quickly conclude, hybridization is a really, really rich field of study. It has a really great historical legacy, and we're only seeing that revitalize as our tools have gotten better at measuring hybridization. And I think given the number of people who've registered for this webinar, it's pretty clear that it's captured the interest and attention of a lot of different folks. There's still a lot to learn about why hybridization occurs and what happens to these hybridizing populations on the long term. Broadly, we know that hybridization is really prevalent in birds, and we also have seen an increase in human activities that have led to increased hybridization, which is of course relevant from a conservation perspective. So as humans continue to modify the globe at a pretty dramatic pace, this of course presents its own challenges, but also opportunities. From a birding perspective, there's a lot of interest in identifying these hybrid individuals in the field, especially in well-characterized hybrid zones. And there's a lot of areas where citizen scientists can contribute data that's really valuable to researchers in both identifying hybrids and then also kind of reshifting how we measure hybridization across bird systems. So I think this is a really good time for me to pass the baton off to both Laura and then Shawn, who are going to talk about this new hybridization feature of Birds of the World and how we can use this to better study hybridization.
All right, that was so awesome. Thank you so much. I really feel like I understand it now. So that's great. So yeah, Shawn, there's still much we need to learn about hybridization and species in general, right? One of the reasons we organized the webinar is not only to show off our new feature, but to demonstrate why this data matters. But can you tell us how people in the audience can use eBird to report the hybrids and why that's meaningful? And after that, we'll go back to some of the more weightier topics surrounding hybridization. But I did want to get that at the beginning.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so first, let me show you what the newly implemented hybridization article in Birds of the World species count looks like. So Laura gave a brief little preview of it already, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into that. So first, I want to take a look at the species account for mallard. And so if you go to the mallard species account, this is what you'll see. And to navigate to the hybridization article, you can get there from the systematics page and just down to hybridization. And this new feature allows us to display all the media that is associated with a particular hybrid combination that is currently in the eBird Macaulay Library database. And in the case of mallard, that is, as you can see, quite a lot. Mallards hybridize with a lot of other species. In addition, you can also click on this little eBird map icon to see where hybrids of those two species have been reported in the world. And so if we click on Eurasian witchen and mallard, we can see, not unsurprisingly, that most hybrids between Eurasian witchen and mallard have been documented in Europe. But for some species, obviously mallards and ducks in general are very photogenic and easy to document and find. But some species might not have much information or any information currently in the eBird database about hybrids or hybridization. So in the case of Williamson sapsucker, we don't see any media or anything brought in from eBird or Macaulay Library because that hybrid currently is not in our database. And there's only ever been 2 documented cases of hybridization in Williamson sapsucker where it crossed with a red-naped sapsucker. In other cases, we may have the option of entering that hybrid cross in eBird and Macaulay Library, but as of yet, there have been no people who have found that hybrid. So the case of yellow warbler and black-throated blue warbler, there are absolutely no eBird observations of this hybrid cross. And this is, something where as people study hybrids more and really scrutinize things, we may be able to fill in those gaps. And I also wanted to mention that this hybrid tool is still very much a work in progress. So while we have added all of the media that exists in our database to every species account, we are also working to add narrative descriptions of hybridization to every species. And obviously that will take quite a while. And we have demonstrations of what we want this to look like in a couple of key species. For example, in barnacle goose, we can see kind of a description of patterns of hybridization with other geese, discussing where hybridization is most common in the world and which hybrids are most commonly produced before we get into all the eBird media that is in there. In the case of black-billed streamer-tail, I will talk more about this species later, but this is a species of hummingbird from Jamaica that we recently recognized as a distinct species, in part because of research that was done on its hybridization with red-billed streamer-tail. And finally, in the case of golden-colored manakin, this is a species that has received an extremely long and extensive and fascinating history of research on its hybrid zones with other manakin species. And so if we go to the hybridization page of that, we can see just an incredibly in-depth accounting of hybridization in golden-collared manakin and what it means for the species and other species. So this new hybrid feature, as I mentioned, draws on the millions and millions of observations of birds that people have submitted to eBird. And just like for species, these data that you submit to eBird are extremely important in helping us to understand hybridization between species. So, for example, I used information from eBird on hybrid sapsuckers in my research on red-naped and red-breasted sapsuckers to help me understand how climate change was influencing the hybrid zone between these 2 species in California and Oregon. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So just because hybrids don't count as a species on your list, entering them into eBird when you see them is extremely important and can really help researchers understand many different kinds of questions and can even have important conservation implications.
All right. Thank you so much. That really helps us understand how and where to use it. I imagine, there's some level of confidence that a user should have before entering a hybrid because birds are so variable within species. Is there any advice you have for us on that?
Yeah, I will say that in most cases, because hybrids in most instances are still relatively rare compared to parental species, unless you live in a hybrid zone, most hybrids will be flagged as rare when you enter them into eBird. And so there will be a level of vetting that happens for every observation that is entered.
Great. And although we have a certain number of hybrids that are recognized right now in eBird, I'm sure with more information, right? More documentation that can probably grow in the future. So if you're in a region of the world that you feel something is underrepresented, just reach out to the folks at eBird, to us, and we will see about, getting it into the system.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Definitely.
All right. So Shawn, I'm going to throw you a really easy question. It's really easy. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. Let's go.
What makes a species a species?
Well, how much time do we have, Laura?
Can you do that in 1 minute or less?
No.
No.
Absolutely not. But I will do my best to condense and summarize what can at times be a very contentious and hotly debated topic amongst evolutionary biologists and taxonomists. And this is also can be a very dense topic. So to give you an idea right from the start of what makes this a contentious topic, there are evolutionary biologists out there who would say that what we call species aren't even real, and that species are just a human construct that we have created as a means to simplify the classification of living things. And while there are certainly many gray areas that make defining what a species is very challenging, like hybridization, my general perspective is that species are indeed real biological entities that exist, and not just a human construct of classification, simply because in the vast majority of cases, species recognize each other as different.
Mm-hmm.
So in the bird world, most global and regional taxonomic authorities generally define species using the biological species concept, which Kathryn talked a little bit about, or a version of it, which generally states that species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Where things get complicated or interesting, depending on who you talk to, is just what reproductive isolation means as it applies to species. So as Kathryn mentioned, in its strictest definition, it could mean that in order to be considered a species, two groups cannot exchange any genes ever. But as we saw in the presentation already, 10% of all bird species have been documented to hybridize, suggesting that there is going to be some level of gene exchange. And this is kind of where the gray area comes in, as the process of speciation is a continuum. So let me just share my screen. All right, so to illustrate kind of the messiness of this process, I will use yellow warblers as an example. So we can probably all agree that a yellow warbler from just about anywhere in the United States and Canada represents the same species. So here I just picked a yellow warbler from New York and a yellow warbler from Kentucky. They look the same, they sing the same songs, and would surely interbreed with each other if given the opportunity. We can probably also all agree, so these would all be a single species. We can probably also all agree that yellow warblers and blue-winged warblers are distinctly different species. Even though they occur in some of the same habitats in the same areas, they have never been documented to have hybridized or interbred. They look pretty different from each other, and they sound extremely different from each other. So these would definitely be considered two separate species and are not the same. The gray area comes in when we think about yellow warblers from here where we are in Ithaca, New York, and yellow warblers from Costa Rica. You can tell that they are kind of similar to each other, but they look pretty different and they sound kind of different. But we really don't know what would happen if their ranges overlapped or came into contact. Would they freely interbreed, or would there be some form of reproductive isolation? There is unfortunately no real easy way to answer this question in the case of yellow warblers, and people have differences of opinion on exactly how to go about answering this question. Personally, for me, until additional research comes out, I prefer to treat them as members of the same species, the same albeit very variable species. In addition to the biological species concept, though, there are also many other species concepts out there And there are entire books on the topic that I will not really talk about, but some other species concepts that are relevant to birds, even if they're not used by the major taxonomic authorities out there, include the phylogenetic species concept, the cladistic species concept, ecological species concept, evolutionary species concept, genealogical species concept, and the genic species concept. In one book about species concept, it lists 32 different concepts out there. So there's a lot of ways to think about what species are, and there's a lot of argument back and forth. But kind of driving back to the main topic of this webinar. So this is a webinar about hybridization. And where does hybridization come into this discussion about species concepts and speciation? Well, as Kathryn talked about in her presentation, hybridization and hybrid zones have been fairly foundational in the study of species and speciation. And on its face, it might seem like the occurrence of hybridization would automatically result in them being considered a single species. However, this is where, again, reproductive isolation comes in. And reproductive isolation doesn't have to mean the complete inability to interbreed and exchange genes. It can certainly mean that, but there are many forms of reproductive isolation. And studying what happens when birds do hybridize can teach us a lot about what those things that ultimately lead to speciation are. For example, in studying a hybrid zone, we may find that while fertile hybrids are produced from two species, those hybrids may have a hard time finding a mate themselves. They might not produce as many offspring as their parents, or they might not survive as long or as well. And all of those things ultimately leads to hybrids passing on fewer of their genes than the parent species. And in this way, natural selection may act to further reduce hybridization over time, or those individuals that produce hybrid offspring end up passing on fewer genes than those individuals that do not hybridize. And when we study hybrid zones and hybridization, we can begin to learn exactly what those differences are between the species that ultimately leads to speciation. And that can teach us a lot about how and why species evolved in the first place. In birds, one common form of this reproductive isolation is mate choice, where members of the same species prefer to mate with each other rather than other species. And this would fall under the prezygotic isolation. A lot of birds show much stronger levels of prezygotic isolation than postzygotic isolation. And even if it's a fairly slight preference over evolutionary time, that can evolve into a very strong barrier that sometimes can prevent all hybridization. But, you know, we can't see into the future, so we can't really know these things for sure.
All right, thank you. So before we get too far off that topic, I wanted to ask this question that was submitted to us. I think they're exploring the gray area between separate species and subspecies, right? And they're looking at the yellow rump warblers in North America and the red-billed and black-billed streamer tails of Jamaica.
So this question really does flow nicely from the discussion of species concepts and species, and it really gets further into that gray area that we've been talking about. So let me go back to our, oops. There we go. So in the case of the yellow-rumped warblers, to give a brief overview for those who might not be very familiar with these two groups, two subspecies, or at least as treated in Birds of the World, which are commonly referred to as myrtle warbler in the east and Audubon's warbler in the west, hybridize along the Canadian Rocky Mountains. This hybrid zone has been studied extensively over many years, and the results of those studies have given some conflicting evidence as to the species status of these two groups. So research of the hybrid zone has suggested that there's actually little evidence for assortative mating, or to put it another way, there's not very strong evidence that myrtle warblers prefer to mate with other myrtle warblers. suggesting that at least within the hybrid zone, myrtle and Audubon's warblers do not recognize each other as different. However, there is also evidence for selection against hybrids, suggesting that post-mating reproductive isolation is occurring. This means that hybrids are in some way less fit than the parents, and that perhaps over time, natural selection may actually act to further prevent hybridization if it leads to offspring that are less successful at passing on their genes. Proponents of recognizing multiple species of yellow-rumped warbler point to the selection against hybrids, as well as genetic differences between not only myrtle and Audubon's warblers, but other subspecies within the complex, as evidence that they actually represent distinct species. On the flip side, proponents of maintaining them as a single species point out the evidence of little assortative mating within the hybrid zone as evidence that they are not good species and just represent really distinct looking subspecies. Neither of these approaches are wrong, but again, further highlights the gray area of the spectrum of speciation and species. In this case, we are actually seeing speciation in action, and it's not necessarily clear at what point something truly becomes a species. In the case of the streamer tail hummingbirds in Jamaica, however, the situation is quite a bit different. So these two hummingbirds are very similar and differ primarily in bill color, with hybrids showing an intermediate bill color. They're extremely similar genetically and show very little, if any, differences at most genetic markers that have been studied. Despite this, the two hybridize over an area that is extremely, extremely narrow, estimated between 3 and 6 kilometers wide, which is among the narrowest of hybrid zones known in birds. Narrow hybrid zones are usually evidence of very strong selection against hybrids and hybridization, because it means that for whatever reason, hybridization and hybrids are prevented from spreading further into the population of either parent species. What's especially interesting is that this hybrid zone has remained fairly stable and with the same width and location for at least 70 years. This is another really important aspect, because another hypothesis out there for why a hybrid zone might be narrow is just that it formed very, very recently, and it hasn't had a chance to spread yet. But the fact that this hybrid zone has been stable and narrow for at least 70 years means that selection must be acting very strongly to maintain it. It's hypothesized that bill color, given that it's one of the few differences between the two species, may be important in species recognition and mate choice, as males prominently show off their bill as part of their courtship displays. That, combined with differences in vocalizations, may be contributing to this extremely strong selection. So in the case of the streamer tails, research has shown that contrary to the situation between the yellow-rumped warblers, selection is extremely strong and species recognition must be very high, providing strong evidence that these two streamer tail hummingbirds are distinct species.
Excellent. Great. All right, Kathryn, I'm going to go to you now and ask, is it true, like there's this concept of hybrid vigor, right? So is it true that hybridization increases biodiversity and the adaptive potential of that species?
Yeah, so I'll also quickly share some slides. I threw that up. Right, so I like this question a lot because it's a challenging question. I think ultimately it's a question of scale, right? So whether or not hybridization is increasing biodiversity and the adaptive potential of a species, or what about hybrid swarms or genetic dead ends? This again is kind of getting at the what happens to these hybridizing populations. And so it's a question of scale because it depends on how are you actually quantifying biodiversity? Are we quantifying biodiversity at the species level, at the clade level, at the allele level? And in terms of adaptive potential, how are you measuring that? Is that in the short term in terms of, 5-10 years of contemporary time, or is this over evolutionary time? Because we know that this speciation process takes thousands to millions of years. And so again, I briefly talked on this, but I want to highlight that hybridization is a really incredible tool that allows scientists to get at a lot of interesting questions, such as the nature of species barriers. It has allowed us to kind of pinpoint the genes underlying physical traits. It's been used to document changes in species distributions, which has been a notoriously difficult thing to document. But beyond being a tool, hybridization is also an evolutionary phenomenon in its own right? This is something that's naturally occurring in a lot of these coexisting populations. And so I threw up this slide at the end of my kind of brief primer, but there's lots and lots and lots of different outcomes of hybridization. And what we're learning as we basically are better able to not only sample non-model organisms, but also sample hybrid zones in multiple locations of these hybrid zones, is that these outcomes vary not only within different species, but within the same species at different points in the hybrid zone. So it's really, really context dependent. And so this allows us to really get at how consistent is evolution. If we have the same set of players, how repeatable are these outcomes? And what we're learning is that they're not necessarily repeatable, that it really, really varies based on the environmental context, on abiotic factors such as temperature, or all these other ecological things that are shaping selective pressures against these different species. And so I'll give a really quick example of another well-studied avian hybrid zone, which is between black-capped chickadees and Carolina chickadees. And so this has been really, really well studied in Pennsylvania, which is being shown with that yellow star. But there's some ongoing work that's actually sampling this hybrid zone at other various points along it in Ohio and Missouri to look at how consistent these patterns of hybridization are across this hybrid zone. And what we're seeing is that they're different. So what's happening in Missouri between black-capped and Carolina chickadees, those dynamics are different than what's happening in Pennsylvania. And that's because the selective pressures of how harsh the winters are in Missouri is different than how harsh winters are in Pennsylvania. And so this creates a really different context for how these two species are interacting. Again, with these kind of advent of genomic tools, we're way better able to document hybridization in a lot of different organisms. And there's a lot of kind of forthcoming within the past 5 years of recent studies documenting a lot of ancient hybridization in a lot of different taxa. So here's just, again, this is supposed to be on birds, but I like to think about all sorts of things. And so this is just a handful of examples of lots of different taxa from all over the world that have these signatures of ancient hybridization. And so whether or not that hybridization is adaptive or whether or not it provides these species with adaptive potential, it's really difficult to demonstrate that, especially if we have to reconstruct these species histories. But this is really where kind of the field of evolutionary biology is going. We're developing better models to be able to test these questions, to be able to estimate adaptive benefits, to be able to measure movement of alleles from one population into the other. And so the short answer to this question is that probably on the short term, if we're looking at the species scale, hybridization is going to decrease biodiversity because it's mixing things back up. But potentially that's the fodder for kind of these evolutionary, adaptive radiations that we see in cichlids or lots of other taxa in really long evolutionary timescales. So it really depends. And I think it's important to remember that none of this is in stasis. These things are all in a state of flux, right? These species are constantly, it's kind of like trying to hit a moving target. Things that are constantly evolving, they're constantly hybridizing. And so it makes these estimating or predicting what's going to happen to species a very challenging question, but it's something that we're getting better able to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you might have answered this, but maybe pull it out for us because we did have this question. Or Shawn, I think this one was for you. But so say you have a hybrid that has adaptive traits and it's doing well and is able to reproduce. Can that eventually become a new species?
Yes, it actually can. And I will go ahead and so the process of hybridization leading to new species, something known as hybrid speciation, is well documented in many taxa, especially in plants, but for a long time was only thought to be kind of a theoretical possibility in birds. However, several proposed examples of hybrid speciation in birds has been described, although it does still seem to be extremely rare, and the conditions required to end up with a new species that is the result of hybridization seem to be very specific and are not usually met under a lot of circumstances. Hybrid speciation requires the production of an evolutionary lineage that is at least partially reproductively isolated from both parent species and has a distinct ecological trajectory or a distinct ecological niche. The occurrence of hybrid speciation in birds is still controversial to some, and even the proposed instances are not accepted by everyone. But perhaps the strongest case for hybrid speciation in birds is that of the Italian sparrow, which appears to be the result of hybridization between house sparrows and Spanish sparrows on the Italian peninsula in Europe. It was suspected to have a hybrid origin based on its plumage, which matched the plumage exactly of hybrids between house sparrows and Spanish sparrows produced in captivity. And genomic analyses have confirmed that Italian sparrow does indeed have a hybrid ancestry from both of those two species. In addition, it appears to be reproductively isolated, or at least partly isolated, from both house sparrows and Spanish sparrows, where the two ranges come into contact. Other proposed examples of hybrid speciation in birds include golden-crowned manakins in Brazil, which appear to be a hybrid between snow-capped manakin and opal-crowned manakin, and a Galapagos finch dubbed Big Bird by Peter and Rosemary Grant. In the case of the Galapagos finch, the Grants were able to document the entire process, which began when an Espanola ground finch arrived on Daphne Major, which is a small island where the Grants have studied finches for decades. And that Espanola ground finch hybridized with a medium ground finch, another species of Galapagos finch. And it turned out the hybrid offspring from that pairing only bred with each other. And it appears to be isolated, at least from the medium ground finch, due to differences in song and bill morphology. It isn't really possible to know, at least right now, whether that hybrid is also reproductively isolated from the Espanola ground finch, because they are only really extremely rare visitors to the island, and so don't normally overlap. So yes, while it seems to be rare, hybrids eventually evolving into a separate species is possible. But again, a bunch of different conditions have to be met. And we probably, it will probably be really difficult to definitively show one way or the other, in most cases, that they are truly the outcome of hybridization events.
Okay, all right, thank you. The next question is, could climate change play a role in the frequency of hybridization? Are we seeing that now? What do we know about that?
Yes, it definitely does. And the role of climate change, hold on. I thought I shared my screen and I didn't yet. All right, there we go. Yeah, so the role of climate change in hybridization is fascinating and has been a particular interest of mine for a very long time. And part of the research I did for my PhD focused on understanding just how climate change may be affecting the hybrid zone between red-naped and red-breasted sapsuckers in Oregon and California. Through that work, I was able to show that the hybrid zone between these two species has shifted over time, generally moving from west to east, with red-breasted sapsuckers expanding and red-naped sapsuckers retreating. This is especially evident in the Warner Mountains of northeastern California and south central Oregon, where there has been repeated studies of sapsuckers in the region dating to the early 1900s. In the Warner Mountains, red-naped sapsuckers were the dominant species present in the early 1900s. But by 1964, both red-naped and red-breasted sapsuckers were equally abundant and they were hybridizing. When I visited those locations between 2011 and 2013, we only found one or two individuals that were actually red-naped sapsuckers, but almost all the other individuals were either red-breasted sapsuckers or hybrids that looked very much like red-breasted sapsuckers. So red-breasted sapsuckers completely moved in and eventually became the sole representative in that region. In addition to the shift there, we also found that red-breasted sapsuckers had expanded in further east into the Ochoco Mountains of central Oregon. And the reasons for these changes are likely complex and multifaceted, but one thing that we were able to show is that these changes closely followed changes in climate change in the area, with each species seeming to track their respective climate niches over a period of at least 50 years. Kathryn already introduced the hybrid zone between Carolina and black-capped chickadees, but this is perhaps an even more striking example of how a hybrid zone and hybridization is responding to climate change. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Scott Taylor and colleagues were able to show that just over a 12-year period, the hybrid zone was moving north, with the northward progression of the hybrid zone appearing to be limited by winter temperatures, essentially with Carolina chickadees being unable to cope with the colder weather, and with black-capped chickadees better adapted to that. And in terms of climate change leading to novel instances of hybridization, I can't really think of any good examples there, but there are some really well-documented cases in other systems, like in mammals. But I will say that many of the hybrid zones that we study now were likely due to range expansions in the past as a result of historical climate change after the ice ages. Most of the famous and well-known hybrid zones that we study are the result of secondary contact, which was likely caused as a result of range expansion following isolation, likely driven by climate change, until those two populations came back together and started to hybridize.
Okay, great. Now, Kathryn, you studied the effects of habitat alteration on a hybrid zone or hybridization. So would you expect a higher frequency of hybridization in birds as human alterations continue on the planet?
Yeah, so this is a nice question following Shawn's discussion of climate change. So I view this kind of human activity or human disturbances as being separate from climate changes. So these are specifically building cities, cutting down forests, constructing dams, anything that's changing like the physical structure of the habitat as opposed to changing kind of ecological factors. And so I think broadly, anything that's going to be changing species distributions or changing kind of the status quo of existing species that coexist in the same space is going to potentially lead to increased hybridization, especially in birds, right? We know that birds have a high propensity to hybridize. And that appears to be because there's not much post-zygotic isolation, right? So when you shuffle up those genomes, there's not much cost associated with that. Most of what's preventing hybridization seems to be on the front end, right? So we think about the fact that things that make birds so, I think, appealing to all of us, the way that they sing, the way that they look with great, plumage and feathers, those are all kind of these pre-zygotic isolating barriers. And that appears to be what these disturbances are breaking the most. And so this is kind of work that I've done for my dissertation, which was kind of comparing these patterns of disturbance to hybridization in chickadees, in this case, black-capped and mountain chickadees. And we found basically that in areas more disturbed by people, we found a higher rate of hybrid mountain and black-capped chickadees, which was pretty surprising. And this was across basically the entirety of the species range overlap. So it seems like, yes, obviously it's hard to tell if this is just an increased ability in our capabilities of detecting hybridization with genomic tools. We're also now looking for it where we weren't necessarily looking for it 10 years ago. But almost certainly, yes, as we continue to modify the globe, that will change the nature of how species are interacting in those spaces.
Okay. So Shawn, can you tell me how the conservation, how hybridization has an effect on the conservation of sensitive species, and give us an example of that?
Yeah, sure. I will preface this with just noting that this is a challenging topic and one that I'm not super familiar with. So I'm just going to provide kind of a broader overview of some of the issues surrounding hybridization and species of conservation concern. In general, hybridization, at least from a conservation perspective, is usually viewed as a bad thing. But as Kathryn noted in her introduction, it can also be a good thing. And we just don't fully necessarily understand what all the outcomes of hybridization will be for species. So labeling it good or bad can be problematic. But in terms of conservation, there are two major reasons why it's generally thought of as a bad thing. So first, in many instances of hybridization and conservation, one of the species involved in hybridization is usually very rare, and the other is much more common. And in these cases, hybridization is often paired with the expansion of the more common species, where it hybridizes with and replaces the rarer species. In the case of the black stilt in New Zealand, for example, the black stilt is a habitat specialist breeding on braided rivers, while the pied stilt, which naturally colonized New Zealand from Australia in the 1800s, is much more of a habitat generalist. And when black stilt populations declined precipitously in the early to mid 1900s due to habitat destruction and the spread of introduced mammalian predators, at that same time, pied stilt was able to expand because they were able to utilize human-modified landscapes and habitats much better than black stilts. And they were also better adapted to cope with mammalian predators. So in the case of the stilts, hybridization became emblematic of some bigger issues, with pied stilt ultimately on track to completely replace black stilt if conservation measures were not implemented. The second issue that hybridization presents is the potential elimination or reduction of unique genetic diversity or genetic lineages from a rare or endangered species. In this way, a goal of conservation when dealing with hybridization is to try and maintain the genetic diversity and evolutionary potential of the rare species by preventing that diversity from getting swamped by the genetic ancestry of another species. But that's, again, conservation and hybridization is a very complex, challenging topic, and not one that I have a lot of experience with. So,
Okay, well, thank you. You did a good job. All right, what's our next question here? Do introduced species hybridize with native species?
Yes, they certainly can and sometimes do. So the example I just shared of the black and pied stilts, that involved the natural colonization of New Zealand by the pied stilt, but species introduced either intentionally or accidentally by humans can also hybridize with native species. And perhaps one of the best known examples of that, best known and possibly most notorious for some birders, is that of mallards. So in North America, probably a lot of people are familiar. Mallards are known to hybridize fairly extensively with American black ducks in the northeastern United States, mottled ducks in the southeastern United States, and Mexican ducks in the southwestern United States. Some of this hybridization may have been facilitated by either the introduction of mallards or stocking of mallards for hunting into new areas, or mallards being better adapted to human modified landscapes that allow them to spread more easily into new areas and bringing them into contact with these other species. But outside of North America, introduced mallards have hybridized with many, many other species. And in Hawaii, that has become a major conservation issue, where it has hybridized with the Hawaiian duck. Hybridization with Hawaiian duck is especially problematic because hybrid swarms of mallards and Hawaiian ducks are now widespread across most islands, and populations of Hawaiian ducks are now very rare. Another species that mallard hybridizes with, where it has been introduced, is the Pacific black duck. Pacific black duck occurs in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And while that species is not a species of conservation concern, some local populations do seem to be threatened by hybridization with mallards. In one study on Lord Howe Island, which is off the coast of Australia, no genetically pure Pacific black ducks were left by 2007, with 81% being either mallard or mallard-like hybrids, 17% being intermediate hybrids, and 2% being Pacific black duck like hybrids. And similarly in New Zealand, 25% of individual Pacific black ducks are now estimated to be hybrids. So yes, introduced species can definitely hybridize with native ones where they have been introduced.
Great. So now I want to ask about a few specific groups or species. First of all, Kathryn, do penguins hybridize in the wild?
Yes, they do. So there are some documented cases of hybridization of penguins in the wild. It's probably potentially more widespread, but because penguins tend to be found in really cold, isolated areas, it's hard for folks to get out there and actually document it. So hybridization potentially goes unnoticed and undocumented. But in certain instances in the Falkland Islands, hybrids have been documented between southern rockhopper and macaroni penguins. In this case, several hybrids were found, some of which were paired with southern rockhoppers and others paired with another hybrid. It's also been documented between southern and Moseley's rockhopper penguin, but in that instances, those chicks didn't survive. And along the western coast of South America, hybridization between Magellanic and Humboldt penguins as well. So in all these cases, hybridization seems to be relatively rare and infrequent, and it's only really been confirmed genetically in a handful of penguins. We also see hybridization occurring in captivity, so it's possible that other species hybridize as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Here's a question. Why do ringneck pheasants in Nebraska look so different from ringneck pheasants in China?
So with ringneck pheasants, there are many different subspecies. There are currently 30 recognized subspecies in birds of the world, and these can differ quite a bit in appearance across their range. So the subspecies that occurs in China is just different from the ones that were introduced to the United States, which are likely a combination of subspecies from Europe and Asia that have all kind of interbreeded and crossed to such an extent that the actual source of pheasants in North America is not entirely clear anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so this is a hot topic right now because the Steller sea eagle has found its way to Nova Scotia, Maine, and those environs. So several people wanted to ask us whether it is possible for a Steller sea eagle and a bald eagle to hybridize. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it certainly seems possible. There have been no confirmed hybrids between these two species that have been documented, but there was one purported hybrid of the two, which was an immature bird that was photographed in British Columbia in 2004. It was thought to be a hybrid based on kind of his intermediate characteristics between bald eagle and Steller sea eagle. In addition to that bird, Steller sea eagle was paired with a bald eagle for several seasons in southeastern Alaska in the late 90s and early 2000s, although I'm not actually sure if those two birds ever raised offspring together.
Mm-hmm. Good to know. Great. So one more kind of fun question here. What are one or two major historic beliefs about hybridization in birds that have been dispelled via more recent advances in genetic analysis? Either one of you.
Who wants to go first?
You can go, Shawn, and then I'll go.
Oh boy. Wow, that's an interesting one. I'd say one of the big ones is just how frequent hybridization actually is in birds. Kathryn mentioned that 10% of all bird species have been now documented to hybridize, at least at some level. And I wouldn't be surprised if the more we sequence things genetically, that number could just keep going up and up a little bit. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily very common between a lot of species, but I think that to me, I think is one of the big things that has been revealed through lots of genetic work.
Mm-hmm.
I would add that probably a belief that was historically held is that hybridization was unimportant and that it was kind of these results of like genetic dead ends, that basically hybrids were produced, but they were sterile or, incapable of surviving as well as parentals. And we're really seeing that that's not the case. So many of extant species have ancestral or ancient evidence of hybridization from kind of their evolutionary histories. So it is an evolutionary phenomenon in its own right, and it appears to be very important for the evolutionary potential of species kind of forward looking.
Great. Okay, so we have just a few minutes. I'll turn on my camera. If you guys wouldn't mind, we did get a few more Q&A in here, and if you wouldn't mind just kind of going down and answering any that you feel that we could complete. We're at 4:10, so we have some time left. Whatever you feel comfortable answering.
Sorry, just looking through the questions.
Sure.
I can take one on really quickly on hybrid vigor, since I think I didn't touch on that. So hybrid vigor is this concept that hybrids do better than either parentals. So they either reproduce more, or they are bigger, or they somehow have a better whatever adaptive potential than either parentals. We don't actually typically see that in birds. We usually see it more in plants. We do see typically that in some cases hybrids are physically bigger in size. So that's something that's really obvious in mammals. So you think about a liger, for example. Ligers are typically much bigger than either a lion or a tiger. What causes that? We don't really know, but that is kind of a noticed pattern. But yes, so we don't typically see hybrid vigor in birds. Typically in systems where we're monitoring reproductive success, hybrids tend to do worse than either parentals. And I can't really think of any examples in birds where hybrids are outperforming either parental.
Okay.
I don't know, Shawn, if you can think of any. I can't.
Yeah, there aren't any like real clear-cut examples of that. There have been some hybrid zones that have been postulated to show that. One system that had for a long time been postulated to show this hybrid vigor within the core of the hybrid zone was that between glaucous wing and western gull. But the evidence for that is very mixed and not strongly supported. And there's evidence of assortative mating in that system. And so, yeah, I can't really think of any system where that is really the case.
Okay. There was one question about definition of what is hybrid swarm. What is a hybrid swarm? Could we just clarify that?
Yeah, so I guess, and Kathryn, feel free to jump in. But to me, a hybrid swarm is basically when pretty much every individual in a population, or most individuals in a population, have some level of hybrid ancestry, such that you don't see representatives of the pure parental taxa anymore. So when I mentioned it for Hawaiian ducks, on some islands in Hawaii, there's basically no genetically pure Hawaiian duck or mallard left. Pretty much everything on the island is in some way a hybrid.
Okay, great. This one should be easy. Is the yellow on the head a definitive marker of a hybrid myrtle or Audubon yellow-rumped warbler?
No, actually, I had chosen that picture because I thought it was the best hybrid image there, but actually both myrtle and Audubons have that yellow patch on the head as well. It's the yellow in the throat that's one of the better field marks for separating the two. So myrtle warblers have a completely white throat, Audubon's warblers have a completely yellow throat, and hybrids have kind of like a whitish, lemony, yellowy wash on the throat. And there are some other finer field marks, but to me, that's one of the easiest ones to see.
Great. How do you distinguish a hybrid chickadee from a black-capped versus Carolina for Project Feeder Watch? Great question.
You don't.
You don't, okay.
Yeah, those two, if you live within the hybrid zone of the Carolina and black-capped chickadee, there's no way of, without doing genetic testing, of identifying those two species. They're too variable, and the two parent species are just too similar. And when I've been there, you can't even rely on song or vocalizations. I've heard birds that look like one thing give the song of another, and everything in between. So yeah, you can't. Sorry.
Great. Kathryn, unless you have one, I'm just gonna do another, or did you see one there you wanted to take on?
I can really touch when there's one on the correlation between the number of chromosomes in a species and its tendency to hybridize. So this gets back at why birds readily hybridize. And that's because they basically all have the same number of chromosomes. And in general, the kind of genetic blueprint across all of the birds across the tree of life is really, really similar, which is the opposite of what we see in mammals. So this, I think, is kind of a nod to mules, right, which have the kind of mismatched number of chromosomes between donkeys and horses, which is why those mules are sterile. That's not what we see in birds. So the only birds that differ in their genome size are hummingbirds. They have slightly smaller genomes than everybody else. But in general, bird genomes are highly, highly conserved, very similar, which is why there's not basically really big evolutionary consequences when hybridization does happen.
Okay. Great. Do Baltimore Orioles hybridize with orchard Orioles? To our knowledge.
Not that I know of. I think, yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Well, here's a way to find out, right? If we open up Birds of the World and you go to either the Baltimore or the orchard, and if there's one there, then it means there's a recognized hybrid. And if there isn't, it means it's not recognized by eBird folks yet.
And yeah. So one question I saw that I wanted to answer: are there any hybrids possible with a plumage similar to a single parent rather than an intermediate plumage? And that's a really fun question. We often think about hybrids as having like a perfectly blended mix of features from each parent, but that's definitely not always the case. Some plumage features of one parent or another might be genetically dominant over another, and so you might see most plumage features or size features or whatever come from one parent over another. And this gets even more mixed up and confusing when we talk about back crosses, like if a hybrid breeds with one of the parents or even with another hybrid, the way those genes get mixed up and shuffled around is anyone's guess sometimes as to what those offspring will look like.
Yeah, great. Well, the easiest
it's actually
way to find out, go to Birds of the World, and if somebody submitted media on that, then you'll see exactly what it looks like. So yeah.
And unfortunately, it's that's something that's not really studied in a lot of systems, in part because the factors that contribute to plumage are just so complex, and there's so many things that interact to form plumage. But in blue-winged and golden-winged warblers, those plumage features are relatively simple and controlled by only one or two genes, and so people have been able to show that certain features are genetically dominant or recessive in those, and you can predict what the hybrids more or less will look like in those.
Yeah, well, that makes me wonder. So we have this new section, right, that's making it clearer than ever before how species hybridize, where they are, what they look like over time. And then again, as our authors work on these accounts, we'll get a lot more narrative information that kind of gives you the context of all that as well. But say there's some graduate students or postdocs out there who are looking for a new project. Can you just describe what this new tool allows them to do, or some ideas that you can think about directions they might go by using this?
Can I jump in on this? I actually used eBird data and mapped hybrids for my dissertation work. So I was like, I can really briefly, I'll quickly share just some really quick slides.
Sure.
Yeah. So I work on hybridizing black-capped and mountain chickadees. They look pretty different, right? So like a black cap for the black cap, nice eyebrow stripe for the mountains. And I first went on eBird in 2016 and I plotted a map of where I found birds that looked like this bird on the bottom left, right? So half like a black cap, half like a mountain. And I came up with this distribution. So these are literal points from eBird. And then I squinted at this map and saw, man, I can really pull out major cities from the Mountain West. You can see the Front Range of Colorado, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Salt Lake City, Moscow, Idaho. There was someone from Moscow, Idaho in this webinar. That pops up on this map. And so this is really what kind of jump-started my entire dissertation framework and came up with this hypothesis that humans were doing something to change how these species were interacting and causing them to hybridize. But this is straight eBird data. So this is a great example of how I actually used what was potentially available to folks, is being able to show these distribution maps of where hybrids are occurring.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. All right, well, I think we're coming to the end. Is there any particular question that you want to address next, or should we wrap things up?
Let me do one last pass to see if
There
there's
was
any.
one on directionality of hybridization and whether or not they're male or females that I thought was pretty great. So as always, it depends. It depends on the species. But there are some pretty good accounts of it actually mattering that we only see hybridization between the male of one species and the female of the other. As Shawn mentioned, usually this is pretty frequency dependent. So the more rare species will hybridize in the direction of the more common species. But we do sometimes see that basically being sex-based as well, that the female of one species, and that has to do a lot with, how is mate choice operating in the system? In chickadees, we know that dominance is really important, and there are dominance hierarchies when species come together, and we see the directionality of hybridization tracking those dominance hierarchies, where females of the subordinate species will pair up or mate with males of the more dominant species. So again, it depends on the system. It depends on how birds are operating or what ecological niches they're filling, et cetera. But it is very possible that we would see sex-based differences in kind of which way hybridization is going.
Wow.
And I saw one, how could one show hybridization in a phylogenetic tree? That is, hybridization and phylogenies are very tricky to deal with. And hybridization can often mask and obscure the relationships between species, because you have, sometimes you'll have these alleles coming from one population into another, and it might look like that species or those individuals that are more closely related to one parent versus the other. So hybridization and showing that on a phylogeny is very challenging. Yeah, and it can really be hard to account for in analyses.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much for just sharing your expertise today. I think you did a fantastic job making this complex issue sound really simple. And grateful to everybody who put the work into this new tool. And hopefully all of you out there will be able to, think about adding the hybrids that you're aware of, and know that, again, it goes someplace that this information is used, it's studied. We're learning a lot about birds and the life histories across every species in the world. So thank you for that. So yeah, we do encourage you to submit your detailed information on hybrids wherever you are. 10% of the world's species. And you said how many genera are aware?
So 20% hybridize across genera. So of that 10%, 20% are going across genera.
Yes, much more than I expected. All right, so thank you all for attending today. If you would like to leave feedback, I think Jessica's going to put a link in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the contact form on Birds of the World, and we will answer it and get any scientific support from this team if they're able to give it. Yeah, stay tuned for our next webinar. It's going to be on April 27th, I think. So wait for the email. But the next webinar is going to feature eBird status and trends. So we're going to have a GIS expert here at the lab, Tom Auer, talk about what they're doing, what, you know, the power of all of these observations that we're getting through eBird. We're able to build these new tools, these new maps, and new visualizations. So we're going to have a demonstration of that and have you understand how you can use it. We're hoping that practitioners in particular will attend. Anyone who's doing research in conservation, I think, you know, either you or your students, I think you'll learn a lot from it. So we encourage you to come to the next one. Yeah, I think again, the recording will be sent out in a few days, as soon as we can get it together. And I thank you all for coming. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Jessica, behind the scenes. Really appreciate all your time and attention today. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks
Thanks,
so much.
Jess.
Thank you.